On January 3rd, something happened that most people still don't know how to categorize. The United States sent Special Operations Forces into Caracas, seized the sitting president of Venezuela, and flew him out of the country to face charges in the United States. Nicolás Maduro is now in American custody. Washington calls it a law enforcement action. A large portion of the world calls it what it looks like, a military intervention against the government of a sovereign nation. And here's the part that matters for what comes next. This wasn't a strike on a convoy. It wasn't a hidden raid in the jungle. This was a head-of-state removal operation, executed by military force, justified in public as policing. That method becomes the message. Because when the world watches a government get physically removed and transported to a U.S. detention facility, the debate stops being about Venezuela's internal politics. It becomes about the rules of the system. You probably saw the official language. National security, drugs, terrorism, democracy, the usual framing words that are meant to close the loop. But the loop doesn't close here. It opens into something bigger. Because Venezuela isn't just a troubled country with bad governance and a collapsing economy. Venezuela is oil, massive oil, sitting on the largest proven reserves on Earth. And for 50 years, oil wasn't just energy. It was the spine of a monetary arrangement that shaped the modern world. The petrodollar system. Not a conspiracy, not a slogan. A real structure. Oil trade priced primarily in dollars, and those dollars recycled through U.S. financial markets. Venezuela used to sit inside that system. Then it started building ways to operate outside it. And now its president has been taken by force. You can argue motive. You can argue legality. You can argue morality. But the sequence is hard to ignore. Venezuela spent years moving oil trade away from the dollar system, and pressure escalated until the situation turned kinetic. This video is about that sequence. Not to romanticize Venezuela. Not to defend Maduro. Not to pretend the drug trade doesn't exist. But to show how oil pricing, payment rails, sanctions, and security power interact, and why what happened in Caracas is not a one-off. It's a signal. And the signal is this. The dollar system is not being presented as voluntary anymore. It is being enforced. That changes how every other country reads the rules. And when a system starts relying on fear rather than preference, it doesn't become stronger. It becomes brittle. This is not financial advice. This is geopolitical and monetary analysis. And if you live in a country that imports energy, you'll feel the consequences in places you don't associate with foreign policy, at the pump, at the grocery store, and in your cost of living. Now we rewind. Because to understand why Venezuela became the stage for this, you need to understand what Venezuela was, what it became, and what the petrodollar actually requires. Venezuela discovered major oil early in the 20th century. By the 1970s, it was a heavyweight exporter and a founding member of OPEC. Its state oil company, PDVSA, became deeply tied to U.S. refineries, especially along the Gulf Coast. For decades, the pattern was stable. Venezuela shipped crude. The U.S. paid in dollars. Venezuela held dollars, bought imports, bought equipment, bought U.S. goods, and parked reserves into dollar assets. It wasn't charity. It was a loop. America got steady supply and global demand for its currency. Venezuela got revenue, market access, and the protection that comes from being inside the system. But there was an unspoken condition. Stay inside the dollar lane. Sell oil in dollars. Hold reserves in dollars. Don't build an alternative payment path that weakens the loop. Reserve systems don't just run on economics. They run on habit, on default settings, on institutional plumbing. And oil was the cleanest engine for that plumbing. If you want the world to hold your currency, you need the world to need your currency. Energy does that. For decades, Venezuelan leaders understood the deal. Stay inside the system, you get access and stability. Challenge the system, you become a problem. Then in 1999, Hugo Chávez arrives, and he does not accept the deal as a permanent truth. Before we go any further, we need to slow down for a moment, because the term petrodollar gets thrown around constantly, and most people misunderstand what it actually is. The petrodollar is not a treaty. It is not a law. It is not a formal agreement you can look up and read. It is a habit, enforced by incentives and consequences. After World War II, the U.S. dollar became the dominant global currency because the United States was the dominant industrial and military power. That part is well understood. What is less understood is how that dominance was stabilized. Oil. Oil is the most traded, most strategically important commodity in the world. Every economy depends on it. Every supply chain touches it. Every military requires it. If oil is priced in your currency, demand for your currency becomes permanent. That is the foundation of the petrodollar system. Oil exporting countries sell oil in dollars. Oil importing countries must acquire dollars to buy energy. Those dollars don't disappear. They get recycled into U.S. assets, U.S. goods, and U.S. government debt. The loop reinforces itself. The U.S. can run deficits because the world needs dollars. The world holds dollars because the world needs oil. This arrangement is extraordinarily powerful, but also extremely sensitive, because it only works if oil exporters accept the deal. The moment a major exporter begins selling oil outside the dollar system, the loop weakens. Not immediately, not catastrophically, but structurally. And that is why Venezuela matters far more than its GDP or its politics would suggest. It isn't about democracy. It isn't about drugs. It isn't even about Venezuela itself. It's about precedent. Because if a country with the world's largest oil reserve can sell oil consistently outside the dollar system, the habit breaks. And once a habit breaks, it doesn't get restored with speeches. It gets restored with pressure. Chávez wasn't subtle. He came in with economic nationalism, anti-imperial rhetoric, and a belief that Venezuela's oil should not be managed in ways that made Washington comfortable. His core question was simple and dangerous. Why should Venezuela sell its most valuable resource in a currency controlled by another country, especially one that can weaponize finance? From the early 2000s onward, Chávez pushed Venezuela away from passive compliance and toward optionality. He increased state control over oil projects. He pressured foreign oil companies to accept new terms or leave. He built oil-for-loans arrangements with China that reduced dollar dependency. He expanded barter-style trade, oil in exchange for services, equipment, and goods. And he publicly encouraged a world less dependent on the dollar. None of these moves alone ends the dollar system. But together they send a message. Venezuela is not just selling oil. It is challenging who gets to control the settlement layer behind oil. That is the real threat. Not a speech, not a headline. The settlement layer. When you control settlement, you control who can trade smoothly and who gets slowed, punished, or cut out. And the United States watched Venezuela move in that direction. Washington didn't invade in 2008. It tried pressure first. This is where Venezuela becomes a case study in how power actually works. The early U.S. response did not begin with troops on the ground. It began with political operations, support for opposition movements, and economic pressure designed to make Chávez unstable. You can debate the details of each episode, but the arc is consistent. Whenever Venezuela hardened its independence, the cost increased. Chávez survived. He returned from challenges stronger. And that outcome matters because it forced the next stage. If leadership doesn't change, the system changes tactics. By the time Chávez died in 2013, Venezuela was already more polarized, more economically fragile, and more isolated. Maduro inherited the ideology, but not the strength. And that made Venezuela easier to squeeze. When Maduro took over, he continued the direction. Closer to China and Russia, less dependence on the dollar system, more antagonism with Washington. The U.S. response escalated in phases. First, targeted sanctions. Then broader financial restrictions. Then the oil sector, the lifeline, became the primary target. And here is the part most viewers miss. Oil sanctions are not just "you can't sell to us." Oil is a complex supply chain. You need tankers. You need shipping insurance. You need payment settlement. You need spare parts. You need specialized equipment. You need technical support. A modern oil industry is not just drilling and pumping. It is maintenance, infrastructure, refining, logistics, and global services. If you cut a country off from those systems, production doesn't fall overnight. It decays. It decays because equipment breaks and can't be repaired. Because refineries run below capacity. Because shipping becomes expensive and risky. Because buyers demand discounts. Because payment becomes complicated. Sanctions are a slow knife. They don't have to stop oil exports completely to destroy an economy. They just have to make them inefficient enough that the country bleeds out. Venezuela bled out. Production collapsed over years. Revenue collapsed with it. Inflation turned into something that stopped behaving like inflation and started behaving like disintegration. And ordinary people paid first. Washington framed this as democracy and human rights. Critics framed it as economic warfare. Both frames can contain pieces of truth. But in this story, the structural effect is clear. Sanctions pushed Venezuela further toward non-dollar alternatives. Because once you're locked out of the dollar system, you stop trying to please it. You start trying to route around it. Between roughly 2017 and 2025, Venezuela built what you could call a survival architecture. Oil sold into Asian markets with settlement that avoided direct dollar dependence. Deals denominated in yuan and rupees. Barter arrangements that moved oil in one direction and goods, equipment, and support in the other. Debt repayment through oil shipments rather than dollars. Bilateral systems with other sanctioned countries that needed the same thing. A way to trade without passing through U.S.-aligned rails. Some of these systems were messy. Some were inefficient. Some were symbolic. But the direction was unmistakable. Venezuela was trying to survive without letting the United States be the gatekeeper. Now zoom out. Venezuela wasn't the only country doing this. Russia pushed non-dollar settlement in energy. Iran built workarounds. China built payment and financing infrastructure designed to reduce dollar dependence over time. And even Gulf producers started publicly discussing currency diversification, not necessarily abandoning the dollar, but diluting the monopoly. This is how reserve systems weaken. Not with one dramatic announcement, with a series of marginal shifts that become a trend. And trends create fear. Because once the world sees a trend, the next question is timing. When does it accelerate? What triggers the stampede? That's where the late 2025 China-Venezuela infrastructure deal becomes central in the competitor narrative. Because it isn't just, we'll sell oil in yuan. It's, we're building the future in yuan. Underscore. Currency settlement can be reversed. Infrastructure is harder to reverse. If a country sells a few shipments in yuan today, Washington can pressure them back tomorrow. But if China rebuilds production capacity, builds ports, refineries, pipelines, and long-term logistics, those are physical commitments. That makes the shift sticky. It makes it structural. And in the competitor story, late 2025 is where Venezuela's de-dollarization stops being opportunistic and becomes permanent alignment. This is the point that would alarm anyone defending the petrodollar system. Not because Venezuela alone matters, but because if the world's largest oil reserves become permanently integrated into a non-dollar settlement ecosystem, the demonstration effect becomes powerful. Other countries begin to ask, if Venezuela can do it, why can't we? And once that question spreads, the system's power becomes psychological. That's when enforcement tends to replace persuasion. Which brings us back to January 3rd. On January 3rd, U.S. forces enter Caracas, capture Maduro, and remove him. The stated rationale is law enforcement, charges, indictments, narco-terror framing. But the method is military. And the method becomes the message. Because if a head of state can be physically removed in an arrest operation conducted by special forces, then every other leader watching understands the implication. This is not just about Venezuela. This is about what happens when a country crosses a red line. You can debate whether that red line is drugs, terrorism, or governance. But in the competitor framing, the red line is the settlement layer of oil. And the outcome is clear. A friendly government is installed, contracts are repositioned, and Venezuela is moved back toward dollar-denominated oil trade. That is enforcement. And enforcement produces a reaction. Underscore. Events like this don't matter because of what governments say. They matter because of what other governments quietly conclude. In the 72 hours after the Caracas operation, foreign ministries, central banks, and energy ministries around the world were not reacting emotionally. They were recalculating risk, not public risk, systemic risk. Oil exporters began reassessing a question they already feared. How safe is it to diversify settlement away from the dollar? Because the message was now explicit. Leaving the dollar system is not treated as an economic choice. It is treated as a security threat. That realization changes behavior. Energy contracts don't get rewritten overnight, but negotiations slow. Clauses change. Optionality gets built in quietly. Importers begin looking for redundancy, not efficiency. Exporters begin looking for protection, not just buyers. And this is where the reaction becomes nonlinear. Because energy markets don't need panic to reprice. They only need uncertainty. Insurance premiums rise. Shipping terms tighten. Risk buffers widen. These changes don't appear on television screens, but they show up in real costs. And here is the key inversion. Traditionally, when the United States projects power, the dollar strengthens. Capital runs toward the center. But enforcement produces a different psychological response than confidence. Confidence attracts capital. Fear motivates escape planning. Countries don't announce those plans. They build them quietly. They test alternative settlement rails. They deepen bilateral trade agreements. They increase non-dollar reserves incrementally, so it doesn't trigger headlines. This is how systems shift before they break. Not with one dramatic exit, but with thousands of small hedges. And once enough of those hedges exist, a system doesn't collapse. It loses exclusivity. That is the danger. Because reserve currencies don't need to disappear to lose power. They only need competition. And competition is exactly what fear accelerates. If you're an oil exporter, this changes the way you interpret your own negotiations. If you're an importer, this changes how you price supply risk. If you're a neutral state, this changes how urgently you build redundancy. Because this isn't about what Washington says. It's about what the rest of the world learns. The lesson isn't the dollar is trusted. The lesson is the dollar system is protected. And protection can look like stability, but it can also look like coercion. And coercion changes incentives. When a system relies on fear, participants don't behave like partners. They behave like hostages searching for exits. And that is how fear becomes the accelerant. Not charts, not speeches. Fear. Underscore. Here's the trap for the United States in this competitor logic. If you enforce the system, you may get short-term compliance. But you also show the world the true nature of the arrangement. You reveal that it is not maintained solely by trust and utility. It is maintained by power. That revelation doesn't strengthen confidence. It makes the system feel fragile. Because a system that needs enforcement looks like a system that is losing voluntary buy-in. And once countries believe they can escape without being crushed, they will. That's where China becomes the exit provider in this narrative. Not because China is morally better. Because China is building the alternative plumbing, financing, settlement, trade corridors, and incentives that reduce reliance on the dollar. That is why the next stage becomes a race. Who builds redundancy first, quietly, before it becomes public? Underscore. If energy trade becomes more fragmented and more political, energy prices become more volatile. If the dollar's pricing power weakens at the margin, imported inflation becomes more persistent. If the U.S. tries to counter those effects while also carrying huge fiscal obligations, the room to maneuver narrows. The point is not everything collapses. The point is, the system becomes less forgiving. More shocks get transmitted into daily life. And fewer tools work cleanly. Even if you ignore geopolitics completely, your life intersects with it through energy, trade, and purchasing power. That's why this story matters. Underscore underscore.